For years now, the name Jeffrey Epstein has been everywhere, tied to wealth, to power, and to a really depraved and secret world. And recently, thousands of court documents were unsealed, throwing this whole story right back into the spotlight and naming some of the most powerful people on the planet. So in this explainer, we're going to unravel this incredibly complex and disturbing story to figure out what's really behind all the headlines. Just let that sink in for a second. I thought I was going to die. That's what one of Jeffrey Epstein's victims said about her abuse. It's a chilling reminder that at the absolute heart of this massive scandal, the one involving celebrities and politicians, are vulnerable young girls whose lives were just systematically destroyed. With so much information and frankly a ton of misinformation swirling around, it's really easy to get lost. So what are these files? Are they really a client list? What do they actually tell us? We're going to cut through all that noise and give you a clear, factual summary of what we know. Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down for you. We'll start with the predator's paradise, then look at the depraved pyramid scheme he created. After that, we'll see how justice was denied, then cover the second reckoning, and of course, unsealing the Epstein Files. And we'll finish up with all the lingering questions that are still out there. So, to really understand any of this, we have to start with the man right at the center of it all, Jeffrey Epstein, and the kind of unbelievable world he built for himself. Epstein's rise was, well, it was as mysterious as it was fast. He started out as a math teacher, but somehow he leveraged that into a career as a financial advisor to actual billionaires. Next thing you know, he has a fortune of hundreds of millions of dollars, and he's surrounding himself with the global elite. We're talking politicians like Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, royalty, heads of state, you name it. And this was his headquarters, a private island that looked like a slice of heaven, right? Pristine beaches, guest villas. But behind all that beauty was a really sinister reality. Locals had a name for it, Pedophile Island. And for good reason. It was the epicenter of his sex trafficking operation, a place where escape was pretty much impossible. So how did this horrific operation actually work? I mean, this wasn't random. It was a carefully constructed system, and it was designed for maximum exploitation. It basically operated like a depraved pyramid scheme. Epstein and his people, they targeted poor and vulnerable girls, some as young as 13 years old. They'd be lured in with the promise of a few $100s for giving a massage. Once they were inside his mansions, they were abused. And them, in this truly cruel twist, the victims themselves were paid to recruit their own friends, their classmates, just perpetuating this horrible cycle of abuse. This quote from Courtney Wild, who is just 14, it perfectly illustrates the deception. She was living in a trailer park, she saw this as a way to make some much-needed cash, and she was just lured right into a trap. And here's Virginia Giuffre, and her story is just eerily similar. She was recruited at 16 while she was working at Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort. Now notice the she's referring to. That she was the key that unlocked this entire operation for Epstein. That person was Ghislaine Maxwell. She was a British socialite with a little black book full of powerful contacts, and she was Epstein's partner in crime. Victim testimonies allege she was the one who found the girls, who gained their trust, and then delivered them to Epstein. And she wasn't just some organizer. Victims testified that Maxwell was often in the room and even participated in the abuse herself. So this trafficking ring, it operated for decades with almost total impunity. But here's the thing. There was a moment when it could have all been stopped. So let's look at how the justice system first confronted and then totally failed to stop Jeffrey Epstein. The first alarm was sounded way back in 1996, but it was just ignored. It wasn't until 2005 that a complaint from a girl's parents in Palm Beach, Florida, finally kicked off a real investigation. And police quickly uncovered a chain of dozens of victims. I mean, they had a mountain of evidence. But then something just unbelievable happened. This right here was the perversion of justice that happened. Epstein was facing federal charges for sex trafficking of minors. That could have put him away for life. Instead, a federal prosecutor named Alexander Acosta gave him a secret non-prosecution agreement. All he had to do was plead guilty to 2 minor state charges. He was sentenced to just 18 months, and he only served 13. And let me tell you, this was no hard time. He was housed in a private wing of the county jail and was granted work release for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. That let him go to his luxury office. And this deal also secretly granted immunity to all of his powerful co-conspirators, whether they were known or unknown. So, for a decade, Epstein lived freely, throwing these lavish parties and flying around the world with powerful people. But the story, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Then in 2018, some incredible reporting by a Miami Herald journalist, Julie K. Brown, exposed that secret plea deal to the world, and it sparked public outrage. All that pressure led federal prosecutors in New York to reopen the case, and in July 2019, Epstein was arrested again. But just a month later, he was found dead in his cell, and it was ruled a suicide. Now, while he escaped justice, his accomplice Ghislaine Maxwell was eventually tracked down, convicted, and sentenced to 20 years in prison. And that brings us right up to the recent headlines. The so-called Epstein Files have been unsealed. So, what are they really? Okay, this is absolutely the most important thing to understand. These documents are not a secret government client list. That's not what this is. They are sworn depositions, emails, testimony from a civil lawsuit back in 2015 filed by a victim, Virginia Giuffre, against Ghislaine Maxwell. That context is key to understanding what's inside. Now, the files do name over 150 people, including some of the most famous figures in the world. But why they're named varies dramatically. For example, Prince Andrew is directly accused of sexual abuse by 2 separate victims. But others, like former President Bill Clinton, he's mentioned for flying on Epstein's private jet, with no specific allegations of wrongdoing in these documents. And the famed physicist Stephen Hawking, he's mentioned for attending a science conference on Epstein's island. And this is the single most important takeaway, so I'm going to say it again. The overwhelming majority of people named are listed as potential witnesses. Victims name them in depositions, saying things like, hey, this person can back up my story, or this person saw me at Epstein's house. Being named in these files does not automatically mean you are accused of a crime. For a lot of them, it just means you were in Epstein's orbit. So you'd think with thousands of pages of documents finally unsealed, we'd have all the answers, right? Well, not exactly. The release of these files seems to have created way more questions than answers. Because what we've seen is just a fraction of the total documentation. There are reportedly over 1 million documents that are still sealed or heavily redacted. So the biggest questions remain. What else is in there? Who else was involved? Or who else knew what was happening and just did nothing? And with Epstein dead and Maxwell in prison, will anyone else ever be held accountable for this huge criminal enterprise? We'll end with this really sobering thought from a journalist who has covered this case for years. As difficult as it is to wrap your head around the details we already know, this warning suggests that the full, horrifying truth of Jeffrey Epstein's network, well, it has yet to be revealed.